days ago it had the general saying we need to cut nuclear weapons in a much deeper way than what Congress said. What is that all about?
There are, I know that you want us to talk among ourselves. Can I
I'm
answer
sorry.
that?
Just answer the question.
Yeah. There are debates in the military about the military utility of nuclear weapons. And also, there are debates within the military about the military utility of nuclear weapons, although I want to stress their threat of first use remains a centerpiece in U.S. doctrine. But there's also general agreement that many fewer could do the same job. And so I think it's about when former generals and statesmen and stuff come out calling for deep cuts, I think what they're really doing is nuclear arms control. We control the arms, and it'll make us look good if we cut them way down, but we'll keep enough in our back pocket, etc. So I think that's what the dynamic of what's going on.
Wait a minute, let me do this in an organized way. Bruce and Irene and Jackie are now going to have a dialogue among themselves. It's now exactly 2, and I think that should be about 10 or 15 minutes at the most, or maybe 10 minutes, and then everybody else can say what they want, ask what questions they want. So I think you should have a chance to talk to each other.
Well, I have a question for Irene. You mentioned the former Nazi officers brought in to help create NATO. Basically, you appear to be saying that the whole NATO operation really is an extension of the Nazi imperial era. Is that what you're saying? That this is essentially what's been created from an ideological perspective?
I would rather like to add first something to what you said, namely this debate on the utility of nuclear arms, because what they are also discussing at this conference over the weekend is the so-called smart defense. And smart defense, there are 2 keywords as far as I understood: smart defense and more cooperative efforts. Smart defense meaning that the nukes supposedly to be modernized, that they can be reduced, that they can be have strategic and tactical use and so on. And more cooperation, a very positive connoting language, means the Europeans are supposed, all as usual, to unite to become more united and to have more of the burden and more of the share into that whole NATO funding thing. With respect to your question, you see, I think at this point we have reached ideological questions are not very useful. I was referring to a historical fact. NATO supposedly is a defense alliance. And the NATO treaty, if you read through it, which should be useful to do so, calls upon the United Nations Charter, it calls upon mutual defense efforts, and NATO language comes along up to now in an even more refined way as very positive sounding language, always referring to the United Nations. We have peacekeeping missions, we have partnership programs for peace, we have humanitarian interventions, we don't have war. Couldn't it be more Orwellian? War is peace. Yeah? And I think these are the things that we really have to see into. And as far as Germany is concerned, because that's the country I come from, I can see that after the reunification of Germany, Germany does not play a very positive role in Europe and in the world. It plays the role of a coercive factor, imposing austerity policies towards its partners, and taking more and more of a share of wanting to have its resources secured in the world. The same you were talking about your country and NATO. So yes, it has imperial overtones. And I think this whole R2P strategy, I don't know if you have heard of that, it's another, well, supposedly a United Nations strategy, but then the United Nations, the Ban Ki-moon, United Nations Secretary, shared hands with Rasmussen, who is the General Secretary of NATO, even not going through the Security Council. I mean, they have an alliance, UN and NATO, although they are something contradictory, right? And this R2P acronym stands for Responsibility to Protect. And guess what it means, responsibility to protect? It was developed after the war against Yugoslavia. We could not watch the massacres going on there any longer. But we must do something. We must bomb for humanity. And there was a huge slogan at one of those peace marches I attended saying, bombing for human rights is like fucking for virginity, you know? And I think this is the kind of things we need to look through their language. They are treacherous. They are deceiving us. That's important.
You reminded me of something I just wanted to share. You talked about the U.S. Releasing convicted Nazi generals. Well, something similar happened in Japan, which I just think we should know about to understand better the historical pathway that we're on. In Japan, in 1954, the U.S. under Eisenhower, after his Atoms for Peace speech, launched a huge PR campaign to sell the Japanese people on nuclear power. And they released a convicted Class A war criminal, Japanese Class A war criminal, from jail to run this operation because he was a media magnate. And they did pull out all the stops PR campaign to force nuclear power down the throats of the Japanese. This is of great interest now, post-Fukushima, of course. I also had a question for you, Elsa, which is that when I was at the Non-Proliferation Treaty Preparatory Committee meeting in Vienna last week, the last 2 weeks, there were a number of German NGO analysts who spoke about NATO and the nuclear weapons in NATO, and particularly Germany, but some of the other countries have at the national level said they would like to get rid of the nuclear weapons. But all of the Germans there, all the German non-governmental people, came to the conclusion that Germany's solidarity with NATO was greater than its individual desire to push on getting rid of the nuclear weapons. And I wonder if you had a comment on that, and also just to say that NATO, in its current NATO doctrine, says NATO will remain a nuclear alliance as long as nuclear weapons exist, which is tantamount to, what the U.S. says: as long as nuclear weapons exist, we will maintain a robust deterrent. All of which means as long as nuclear weapons exist, nuclear weapons will exist.
You called me Elsa.
I'm sorry. Excuse me.
I'm Irene.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry. There's Elsa. Hi.
There's Elsa. Yeah, I thought you.
I just take them.
I'm sorry. I apologize.
Okay. Well, you might know that the declared German policy, that is consent, there has been consent among all parties represented in the parliament. That the nuclear weapons should be withdrawn. I mean, it's officially declared German policy. It has been part of the coalition treaty that was, signed or arranged for when the government was formed, right? But you are quite right, and my colleagues talking to you were quite right. It is one thing to have a coalition treaty, it is one thing to have an agreed upon policy, and it is another thing to serve the interests of an oligarchy. And the oligarchy, I'm using this term, oligarchy, you could also name it the 1%. You could also name it the military-industrial complex, the oil industry, and the banks. The banks finance these nuclear devices. I'll give you an example with respect to Greece, because Greece recently, of course, caused a lot of discussion. Greece is buying, or I should say rather was persuaded into buying German nuclear submarines. Now, first of all, what does Greece need nuclear submarines for? And secondly, of course, who is financing these submarines? German banks give the credits to the Greece government so that they buy German, among many other things, of course, but this is the most outstanding, nuclear submarines, nuclear-capable submarines, and then, of course, it's a debt trap, and then they have to be given German tax money into refunding the banks. I mean, you know all that. But there is I think we have to think more in terms of interest coalitions or interest coalitions. We, the people, need nothing more than redivert funds from the military to human needs in order to support our communities, in order to support health systems, schooling, and so on and so on. And we have to focus on that. And of course, we have to work with official agreements. We have to say, look, our government, when we talk to whoever, to our constituencies in my country, this is what the government parties signed. This is what all the coalitions agreed upon. And what do? So let's build up a grassroots movement, as you were also mentioning, and see to it that people get more aware of what's going on, and that they organize, and that they raise their voices, and that there be a groundswell. This is the only possibility to enforce the policy that we all agree upon, I guess. Nuclear-free future and no to warfare.
But we can't lobby.
Well, who would? We'll go on to the next, then we could go on all night back and forth. I'm going to take the privilege of the chair and say my piece just for 2 minutes. I think at this stage in our history, the U.S. is perpetuating one war after another. And I've just written an article on what's happened to the Iraqi people and the unbelievable tragedy that's happened to the Iraqi people. Irene was explaining something to me that in all my reading I didn't know. And that is the U.S. planes that supply the troops in Iraq, the U.S. planes that supply the troops in Afghanistan, all go from NATO bases in Germany. Many of them. We could not wage war if we did not have NATO bases in Germany, because Germany is centrally located. The bases are all equipped to wage war, and that's why when I conceived this workshop on getting rid of NATO bases, is we have to get rid of these wars, and one way of getting rid of these wars is getting rid of these NATO bases, and we have to understand how central these NATO bases are to waging war. Now I won't say another thing.